huge honor to have with us Dr. Oleksandra Keudel. She is from the Kyiv School of Economics. So I think many of you know here that we have a strong and enduring partnership with the Kyiv School of Economics, where Oleksandra works, but for the time being right now, she is a visiting fellow at the Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies at George Washington University. But she is an assistant professor at the Department of Public Policy and Governance at the Kyiv School of Economics. And for those of you who don't know, we at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh have a partnership with that department and a student exchange that we set up long before the war in Ukraine began. And so her research, she focuses on local democracy, social movements, civic engagement, as well as business political arrangements at the local level in Ukraine. She's consulted with many organizations, including the Council of Europe and UNESCO. She has a PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin in Germany, as well as a master's in international administration and global governance from the University of Gothenburg, where we also have a strong partnership. Yes. And an MA in international information from the Kyiv Institute of International Relations. So she has extensive experience in the public and the private sector working on issues of local governance and civic issues in Ukraine and beyond. And it's a huge honor to have you here to talk about what makes Ukraine resilient in an asymmetric war, the study of local governance emergency responses. And I think this story that we will hear today, the story of local governance in Ukraine, is really the story that so many people have not heard about this war. That a lot of people talk about the resilience of Ukraine, the resilience of Ukrainians, but this bottom-up approach, which is so close to our hearts at the Center for Governance and Markets, we call our center the bottom-up center. This is so close to our hearts. So we're so just thrilled that you could come from Washington and join us today. So thank you, Dr. Keudel. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer, for such a warm welcome here at the University of Pittsburgh and the center. It is really my pleasure and honor to talk to you here and to welcome the audience here online. And I do appreciate the opportunity to really tell this, as you said, untold story of local governance and how local governments deal with multiple crises that have emerged due to the war. Let me start with what actually we mean by asymmetric. And maybe important note is this is a co-authored study. We're together with my very long-term research partner, Oleksandra Keudel, who is a Ukrainian scholar by origin, but she is at the Bologna University in Italy, and she was also in Germany with me. And together we have done the study at the request of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe. This is a political representation of the local self-government in the intergovernmental organization that covers European countries called Council of Europe. So that's not a part of the European Union. It is much broader. And so let me go for why we call it an asymmetric war. So when we look at the military spending between Ukraine and Russia, you can see that Ukraine is spending, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the forces were really incompatible. And because of this, a lot of observers predicted that Ukraine would not stand. At the same time, we observed that it is not true. It is also asymmetric because this is a war against civilians. When we look at the number of civilian casualties, just the official numbers, there are by January there were 18,000 people hurt or killed, and among them 7,000 killed. But these are just official numbers, and the real numbers are much higher. We just don't know. Plus, there are about 12 million people who have been displaced either abroad or within Ukraine. It's one of the largest displacement stories since the Second World War. And Kyiv School of Economics also counts the direct material damage. And by November, it was $136 billion. And in fact, all of this comes down like empirically at the municipalities, and their local authorities are at the forefront of all these damages and displacement challenge. So we started to ask, but at the same time, we see a lot of resilience. So our question was, how do local authorities contribute to the resilience of Ukraine in the war? The focus on local authorities is also justified because Ukraine has gone through a decentralization reform started in 2014. Due to there were three pillars to this reform. So one is the administrative. The small, about 12,000 small and capable communities were amalgamated into 1,439. So much amalgamation. They increased efficiency in their governance. Political changes meant that the local authorities received competences to deal with education, with healthcare, which made them more legitimate actors in the local level. And of course, there was a fiscal component when more of local of the personal income tax, for example, the number of other taxes, which they could keep right away, because before the decentralization, they had to get it to the central budget, and then there was a system of redistribution through the regional and district authorities. But at the same time, while the centralization reform has been going on, Ukraine has embarked on the digital transformation, which is an immense attempt to make digital government as a country in a smartphone, it is called. And one of the outcomes is the so-called Dia app, where we have, you can register for a baby via an app, for example, and a lot of other things, like if you relocate your business, you can apply via an app for government support for it. And in these structural changes and the digitalization has moved on towards shifting the governance in the local authorities towards collaboration, because the local authorities, they were now more legitimate actors. They were, and the local communities were asking for more participation, more accountability. So the collaborative governance started to emerge. Martial law has to put some limitations on this. So electoral accountability is not possible. Direct democracy mechanisms are also not possible. Transparency requirements have been lowered. For example, some open data is not open anymore. And mayors have received some rights to single-handedly decide some of the issues which are considered more of a security issues. So there are, in the theoretical puzzle we were thinking of, is that decentralization actually can have double consequences for the ability of the government to respond to a crisis. On the one hand, it can be an obstacle because there are multiple centers, they can be competing between each other, it can be a slow and uncoordinated response. At the same time, decentralization actually can drive resilience, because when citizens are closer to the authorities, they can assess the state, they know the needs, they have the resources, they can quicker provide them for the solutions, and collaborative governance between the levels of authority, they can enable coordination. This is what we saw in some of the COVID responses in the European states. So, and we made a theoretical proposition about what kind of governance can lead towards resilience. So when we look at this picture, on the right side we have resilience and an outcome. On the left side we have the governance processes. So anticipation, foresight, thinking of what kind of futures can be there. Vertical government coordination are part of anticipatory governance framework, and then collaborative governance is means that you have processes of horizontal coordination between local, national, international levels, but also public engagement. Taken together and underpinned from the bottom by the technology and from the top by values of human rights, equality, equity, so what our people in Ukraine are now fighting for. This leads to resilience because collaborative and collaboration and anticipation, they allow to mobilize resources and to learn from each other. And this leads to ability of actors to allocate resources better to where they are needed and thus respond faster. So we did, as already mentioned, the survey of how local authorities are dealing with the crisis. And we did it with together in partnership with the Association of Ukrainian Cities, which is the biggest local government association in Ukraine. We did a survey in August with we received 241 responses. This is about 17% of all municipalities in Ukraine. We have responses from all regions, but one in the West Kyiv region and Kherson region we don't have. Otherwise, we have all the regions. And in each region, we have also about 18% of municipalities that have answered. Mostly we have answers from smaller municipalities, so 50,000 people and less, urban and rural. And it's it means that what we show here are not the practices of some very resourceful big cities. These are actually practices of much more modest context. And now coming to the results, we found out that local authorities emerged as actors of democratic resilience, because what we see is, first of all, they preserve their normal operations, most of them, despite the war. 28% never stopped operating, 43% returned to normal into about 2 weeks after the invasion. 72% provide administrative services, and most of them in full. So, as I said, we also have had municipalities that have been occupied. We had one municipality in the Luhansk region that answered us from their hostilities and occupation, and still they were operating in certain ways. Then they kept they focused on the legitimacy of their response, because we have governance at the local level is done via the collective so-called councils, local councils. So they were 82% emergency decision making was guided by the council or executive committee decision. They are all collective bodies, and 80% held council meetings 1 to 3 months after the full-scale invasion, even offline, which was, for me, was a big surprise. And this is and we see that the local authorities have very high trust of the population in Ukraine. This is a representative survey data, and we see that 63% of Ukrainians trust mayors and 60% trust councils. Before the full-scale invasion, this was about 50%. So actually the trust levels have grown. Now let's see what they are actually doing. Coming, as we said, with the digital technology supports the response. And we found that electronic governance actually supports emergency responses. We see that, for example, having elaborated data protection policies and internal e-documentation system was very helpful. The issue we found is that many don't have it, but as you see, with those who have, they find it very, very helpful. And the e-governance platforms. So that means technology should be supported for a more resilient response. Now coming to the anticipation. Sorry, the planning. So this graph shows the planning horizons of the Ukrainian municipalities, and we see that although a majority had emergency plans, 69 found them also helpful, which was a bit of a surprise for us. And some used scenario planning. Scenario planning is different, is because it's not like a hardcore planning, what you do step by step, but it's more like, okay, in case this happens, what do we do? Who do you contact? Where do we meet? And so on. And the horizon, but the issue we found is that the horizon planning is just 6 months. It's a little bit too little for robust planning. Nevertheless, as our interviews have shown, for example, this is an interview from a city called Slavutich in the north of Ukraine, which got occupied in really very first days of the full-scale invasion. And they said that on the eve of the invasion, the leaders of communal enterprises gathered to prepare for the crisis. And the person with whom we spoke, she said that this made her understand how they will coordinate their actions. Then in Zhytomyr, which was never occupied but was bombed, they were preparing for the heating season, because what do you do when Russia is destroying the critical infrastructure? So they were trying to provide alternative heating instead of gas. And the city of Ternopil it is a very interesting case because, as I said, in Ukraine, digitalization was going very fast, or is going still very fast. They are making the maps of everything, digital maps, is very common. And so this city created the maps of the bomb shelters, which they just publicized after on the 24th, again, to remind the city. This city is in the west, and they only had the alarms and missiles. They were not in the hostilities area. Now, it's very important that the levels of governance for the proper crisis response, that they communicate effectively. And here we see that Ukrainian local authorities think that their communication with the central authorities and with regional military administration and district military administration is actually very well coordinated. And we believe it is one of the factors why Ukrainians can respond fast to the crisis. Let me give you an example of this kind of communication. So in the Livno, it's in the west, they had a lot of internally displaced people came. In order to coordinate the response, they put together a council consisting of all the heads of the cities, plus the regional administration, for these four purposes. They were making management decisions together. They take statistics from our communities, so data-driven governance actually, identified available housing in their localities so that not everybody just comes to the regional center where there is maybe not so much place, but it's common that villages might have empty houses there. And to coordinate with household owners to relieve the burden of schools and dormitories. This is a part of our planning and anticipation because schools were first like, okay, where do we put our internally displaced people? Schools, dormitories. And then they realized, okay, but where do we teach children if it gets longer, right? So this is anticipation, which is solved collectively. In this kind of, although it's a vertical communication, because it's a very, they created a very horizontal platform to put together actors from different scales of governance on the same level and solve the problems that they had also using data and communication. I think it's an amazing, and it's not a one case, it's just an example, it's quite common. So coordination is very important, as I said, in order to deal with lots of always coming crises. And we find that coordination on strategic decisions is there between the levels of governance, but it needs more cultural feedback and influence. This chart shows that on the one hand, Ukrainian local authorities think that the central government coordinates on strategic decisions with them, but they feel like they cannot influence these decisions, or at least many feel skeptical about it. And many here and here, we don't see it, sorry. And the many here and here show that they are not even certain what happens to their feedback. So when we talk about recovery, when we talk about response, we always recommend, like our Center for the Study of Decentralization, for example, KIC, that you need to install the feedback loops, because then the actors will be sure that they're heard, plus you are more sure that local needs are taken into account. Because the thing is, you cannot do it vertically because situation on the ground changes too fast. No central authority can monitor it properly. Now coming to horizontal coordination. This is what we discovered is that Ukrainian local authorities also can get a strong response to multiple crises because they cooperate between each other. They have some membership in local authorities associations with a helpful practice for 71% of municipalities. We have three bigger associations, and depending on the size of the municipality, they participate in it. But also what was interesting, they established links with other communities in Ukraine and helped, for example, with humanitarian missions, with unoccupied municipalities would bring bread, smuggled bread into the occupied municipalities, for example. And international partnerships. As you see on this chart, again, so those who have it, they find international partnerships really helpful. And we have 35% of our respondents established new partnerships while the war was raging, which shows again that the governance is working and there is a way of and there's a skill to establish international partnerships. But what they need more is opportunities for personal contact. Because there are now digital platforms for matching the municipalities in other European countries and Ukraine, but they also need more face-to-face. Okay, and now maybe my favorite slide of all. I know it doesn't look very fancy, but actually it tells a story. So we found out that you might have heard a lot about, Ukrainians are very self-organized. There are lots of local initiatives, volunteers bringing drones to the area, to the army, or bringing food and so on and so forth. But we find that the local authorities became like coordinators and nodal point in this kind of communication between actors. So we asked local authorities whether they introduced anything for citizen informing or participation, including the business. And we got a response from that most of them did, and most of them, and we asked what was the purpose, why they introduced participatory or information tool. And we see that they are they're very pragmatic in why they involve citizens. They involve them in problem solving, first of all. So this, as you can see, the blue ones is what I call the pragmatic purposes. So the biggest purpose is to coordinate supply and demand for help. So coordinate all those volunteers, all those international donors and other actors, and those who need this help. Ukrainian armed forces or the internally displaced people. But we also had the data from the 2025 survey, and there was a similar question about attracting external resources. And we see that in 2022, we had a plus 33 percentage point of municipalities who said that they attract external resources via citizen participation. We think it is a very smart goal, first of all, pragmatic, and it can start building trust because the citizens are not mere clients who have to be served, protected, and so on, but they're also partners who can solve the problems. Then, the second is good governance, so-called good governance goals. We see that quite high on the agenda of many municipalities that they introduce citizen participation to increase community trust into local authorities. You have to imagine, like, they work in, it is a very unstable environment in which they work. They have a lot of, there is a new, you never know when a missile hits your central heating plant, right? It's a lot of uncertainty, but still they think about building trust to their communities, which is a very, normally you think it's like a peace goal. But it is very important for holding this cohesion, which you observe from the outside. Then more municipalities now engage their stakeholders to problem solving. That means IDPs are asked what to do to help them, rather than just treating them as clients. And but inclusion of diverse opinions, so consultation, just for the sake of consultation and diversity, it actually went down. So less municipalities do this. They simply don't have support. And that's why we say that the engagement got more pragmatic. But what is interesting and amazing, especially, is because plus 20 percentage point, our respondents said that they engage people for anti-corruption. So you might have heard, Ukraine has problems with systemic corruption. At the same time, there has been since 2014 a very big drive to deal with it on different levels. And municipalities know that this is a sensitive issue, and they preemptively show what they do. For example, they would be showing what kind of humanitarian aid there is, or they would be creating special, it's like a customer management systems, but for receiving of humanitarian aid, and they tell the people that we have received so much, we have given out so much, we have pictures and so on. So they try to preemptively show that they work with integrity. And the green process will become community well-being, as you can see, meeting the needs of vulnerable social groups and strengthening community cohesion is done via citizen participation. So again, they see the communities as not recipients, like compared to passive recipients of authorities, but their partners. So in these pictures, these kind of pictures, you might have seen in the news how people mobilize and help. And this is what we see also nowadays. Again, big slide, but the most important is actually this gray line. So we would compare the data from 2021 and 2022 in terms of what kind of stakeholder groups they engage. And less municipalities than in 2021 said they engage nobody. It just means that the engagement became much broader. And the second amazing finding is that one group of that of entrepreneurs, the purple ones, it got a much more stronger involved group. So it means that more municipalities now engage business. Again, it's a very pragmatic. Business has resources, but it also shows that the business is becoming more like, again, a partner, because we see that if you look at the levels of citizen engagement, the higher ones, the partnership and dialogue that require more respectful dialogue, more like of a partner on the same eye level communication. Here we have business plus 25 percentage points compared to 2021 and plus 30 percentage points. It means more municipalities engage businesses in as really partners, corporate, you could call it co-production, right? They co-produce solutions for these crisis-related problems. And this is what I wanted to give you an example. It's from Patronal, from the focus group, one of the municipality heads. So he said that IDPs came to the local authority and offered help. And then the IDPs did a survey via chatbot to know who of other IDPs can do what. Then they also made the municipality organized a networking meeting for the local business and for the businesses that have come, for example, from the Kyiv region that has been heavily involved, to see where those business people can find overlap. And we brought business people to meet each other, new businesses slowly started to open. And the Zhytomyr also employed immediately some of these IPPs once they learned that they have all these digital skills, because Kharkiv is a very strong place for such skills. So it's an example. And to summarize, because I want to leave time for your question, decentralization reform really contributed to conditions for the resilience, because it proved to be something like a backbone, like a skeleton for the societal resilience. Then this is marginally this because collaborative governance has emerged, and it turned out that it supports legitimate emergency responses. So not just some kind of a very centralized top-down response, but also the response that supports this self-organization of the society, which in my opinion, it is something to learn from post-war security in a democracy, there where people are used to be part of the decision making. And the citizens are seen here as partners versus the citizens just as clients. And in our opinion, with my co-author Oksana, what we see is really a mental shift in this, or like in the minds of people, which is shifting the social contract in Ukraine. That in the Soviet system, it used to be a lot of subordination to authority. Then post-Soviet times was a lot of detachment from authority. We now see in Ukraine collaboration with authorities. And this is a way to build maybe new type even of democracy, which is not what we know as a representative democracy in the West, but some kind of a special way of doing it in countries where people are, where you don't separate spheres of social action. And what does it mean? We also thought on findings about societal resilience they challenge our conventional thinking of security just in the military terms. So we should look at the security can be provided by military terms, of course, but you need this kind of social resilience, societal resilience to support the resistance when there's a big war. They provide insights about new forms of public participation and accountability that happen not through these formal channels we used to put in democracy, in a representative democracy, but more through creating collaborative, so-called accountability fora. And they highlight the role of data and digital technology in making security. So data, of course, can make us vulnerable because they can be hacked, right, and so on. But on the other hand, we can provide important services using digital technology when we cannot do a lot of things physically in a location. And it raises a new empirical question, how to organize governance processes that support societal resilience when there are big security threats. So thank you very much. That was on my side, and I'm happy to answer the questions you may have or online.
So I mentioned we'll have lots of questions, so I'll just let you, Oleksandra, take the questions yourself, and maybe Brian can read the questions that come up online. I mean, I have lots.
I mean, please.
Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, this was really interesting. Do you have, I remember you mentioning that most of your data comes from smaller areas. Do you have any thoughts or any kind of insight as to, you know, how you think larger cities would, you know, have the same result?
I guess I'll just answer one by one, right? We have time for that. Because with larger cities, it's kind of a bit easier to observe it. I can give you an example of the city of Lviv in the western Ukraine. It has often historical, I would say since 2009, it has been developing this kind of collaborative governance culture with the businesses in creative industries really involved. By creative industries, we mean IT and tourism. Lviv is one of the biggest IT hubs together with Kyiv and Kharkiv in Ukraine. And so how they react. Lviv was even at the background of reaction because even in 2021, they already made a resilient strategy. They discussed with the help of foreign donors, they discussed what will be their action plan if something happens, and what will they do to support military units that are in their location, what they will do in terms of cyber security, and so on. So they were really far ahead. And that's why this is what we call, they really did this like both, you know, anticipatory governance, they thought about it, they did it in a very collaborative fashion. Other big cities, like Zhytomyr, this is the one which took the refugees to help themselves, so to say. Even big cities that had controversial reputation, like in the south of Ukraine, a city called Odessa, there's a mayor who apparently even has a Russian citizenship, right? And still, even there, they held on to Ukraine, and they did not, you know, people expected worse, I have to say, but that is why decentralization is so important. We did an interview with one of the top managers in the Ministry of Regional Development. It has been reorganized, but back then it was still a ministry, and he said local mayors, and they have realized what is the value of decentralization. They can manage their communities, they are part of their communities, and they understood that if should Russia be there, there will be no such freedom. And that's why they resist and they stand for it. And that's why even those that are considered, let's say, a bit of a gray zone, even they go for you and independent Ukraine.
Yeah. No, I think another interesting question could be, you know, how big should these different cities or these different in a federalist or kind of in one of these decentralized systems? How much division should we do across cities, and how small should we be? I think it's interesting that larger pieces can still achieve forms of coordination that some of the smaller ones can. So,
I mean, of course, because smaller ones have capacity issues, like they're in a village administration, objectively, there is less people and less people who have the necessary skills. But what we see happening in Ukraine, agglomeration. So Lviv, for example, started building its own agglomeration, and they help the neighboring, not just villages that are part of their Armada, but the other municipalities in their agglomeration. That is how they can be a skill issue can be a bit
I see.
involved.
So they can kind of self-organize and be super organizations and themselves, they do it by themselves.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
And interesting, they rarely institutionalize it. So when I say about Lviv is like an example of bigger institutionalization. There are lots of other informal coordinations between bigger cities and the smaller cities around or villages around them, which maybe not so institutionalized like agglomerations.
To me, it seems like the resilience is an outcome of existing structures. I wonder how much resilient is the structure itself? Like, how much do they change in response to occupation?
The thing is that these structures, they are themselves very flexible. So these are network structures, very little hierarchy, except of course there's a military hierarchy, right? But I'm not touching it right now. I'm now looking at this more what local authority, the civilian systems doing it. And it seems they are very resilient because a lot of them are built on personal, people know each other personally and on personal connections. And let's say I know Jan knows somebody else, then I can trust that somebody else because Jan trusts this person. And these are very robust structures, and they have been often studied as a problem for democratization. Actually, in Ukraine, if you know patronal politics, it's done through these networks of personal acquaintance. But in fact, in this kind of situation and underpinned by different values, these are helping social capital. It's a social capital, yeah, exactly. So it's a social capital, and it's why they. I mean, I'm myself divided about how much they must be institutionalized, but some sort of institutionalization is needed in order to make sure that it doesn't get into some kind of negative phenomenon. And this is what I think interesting when more business is now involved. We should make sure that their involvement is, let's say, socially also positive, because, yeah, that it remains a social capital doesn't turn into patronalism, let's say, yeah. But time will show.
So I have a question about the self-amalgamation, the Pramada process, and its relationship to this outcome. So you mentioned that before the war, it was a part of the post-Maidan reforms, 2014, that there was decentralization. And what was so unique about Ukraine is that the law on decentralization allowed communities to self-amalgamize. They decided who was their community.
Yeah.
Right? That's very unusual because usually the top even decides what is the boundaries of the community. And in this case, there was a desire to consolidate villages and communities so they could decide themselves how to self-amalgamize.
Just to a certain extent, right?
Not all, right?
Yeah.
Some self-amalgamize and then some later, the ones that did not.
They were merged because we had elections in 2020. It was really important to get the administrative structure for the elections, because otherwise it would have been really a mess if some were amalgamated and some weren't. That's why the government amalgamated them, the remaining ones, by administrative measures in the end. But yeah, those that amalgamated earlier, they benefited from additional. Because this developed, the amalgamation was accompanied by a lot of funding opportunities, also from the government of Ukraine, but also foreign donors, skill training, and so on. So they benefited from it.
So can you say a little bit about what, is there some endogeneity here in terms of the drivers of self-amalgamization? So maybe that those communities that moved to amalgamize together were much better. They had that sort of positive social capital. They had strong
they had strong ties, and that they were able to benefit from many of these mechanisms. Do you see a difference between those formatas that self-amalgamized and those that did not?
So I myself did not do this kind of research. I know the Center for the Study of Decentralization at Kyiv School of Economics is now doing it. I know the preliminary data actually doesn't show it is so much more beneficial that these communities amalgamated earlier. But what the data shows is those that had more social capital, like self-organization of house owners, for example, or those that had better or bigger international projects with international donors, because we also consider it as social capital, because they could then go to their partners, right, later and ask for help. Those did better in terms of their resilience indicators that colleagues have found, which made me now think what we could try to run our model on is to see, is there a difference, like what kind of communities are those, the amalgamated ones or voluntarily or not? So I cannot tell you now.
It has a very similar flavor to like integration and firms, which firms integrate, which firms don't. Some of that theory might be relevant here.
This is good why we have the economy.
Yeah.
Here is the difference.
The thing is that this voluntary amalgamation was more like a political process, which doesn't mean that actually economically that was necessarily the best option, right? Of course, the government looked that it had to make sense economically. I know that they had a structure of Ukraine, which they calculated according to more like economic viability. It was more like that the more influential heads of municipalities who thought that they could find agreement from the municipalities around and stay in place after the amalgamated elections, then this kind of drove a lot of amalgamation. At the same time, I was working with one municipality in Odessa region. There I know that the opposition to the mayor at the time was driving amalgamation because they didn't like his style of governance, more like he tried wanna be autocrat in the village. Now it was more like that. So,
But now he's very popular, right?
no, he was not elected. They elected a new mayor in the amalgamate. In that amalgamated community, the opposition mobilized more like civic activists, small businesses, and they got a different mayor after elections.
Yeah, I guess a lot of these questions to me are sort of like, you know, are you testing out the theory in a paper like this? And I mean, I think seeing all this resilience, I think you've got like, you know, a lot of evidence of resilience, but I mean, it just seems like, you know, I guess other examples where you just didn't have these kind of reforms, like even case studies where like the governments were kind of like just not doing this kind of thing. And in those situations, like, can you observe, you know, that people are upset about it or a lack of resilience?
You mean in municipalities who did not?
Yeah, well, I guess if I were to say if resilience is the outcome, if you were gonna do like a statistical analysis, and you've got like, you know, hundreds of local government units, and then you can kind of look at the extent to which like levels of resilience at each municipality, at each government level, right? And then you just do a statistical analysis, and then you have like a bunch of factors that you think would explain that. But then you can also control for other things, like we're talking about social capital, right? Like, because social capital versus like institutional reforms might explain that. Someone might say like, well, Ukrainians just have a lot of social capital. So even if you didn't have good governance institutions, that would explain like the resilience, you know what I'm saying? So if,
I mean, we don't
I'm
have-
gonna say, are you gonna do some econometrics?
Yeah, so this is what the Center for the Decentralization Studies is doing, because I don't have the skills for quantitative research. But what I think also, I believe not everything will be also shown in models. And what is the social capital, right? People organize, self-organize, and so on. Question is, does it keep the statehood? Because what we are seeing here is not just a geographical place where people resist the war, but education services are provided, maybe not perfect, but they provided, healthcare is provided. We have, as I said, businesses can re-register, relocate, get money for it. Of course, we have all kinds of problems in governance, like new democracies would have, but I don't think without the elements of good governance, just the social capital will make the state running. Because they have, what we see is, these are, what I was showing you, these are not new forms of coordination which appeared because of the war. They have been building before, right? Starting with the decentralization before. That's why I think social capitalism, without social capitalism, we probably will also not do this, but we need the two parts. So that you need economic resources, you need social capital, and you need some kind of a coordinator there. And if it's a coordinator is the governance level, you keep the state, because that's also a question, how do you make a state functioning in the world, not just people surviving. I hope you can invite our center here for a talk when they finish their research on that will be with the models and the more like economic, not economic, sorry, statistical analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, like, I think, Timothy Brick is doing a lot of work looking at like the impact of reforms on social capital. So I think it all aligns. I mean, I think obviously, like, when you put all of this together, it's great. I mean, I think what you described here, a lot of times when we talk about like decentralized or federal systems being more resilient, like you don't get kind of really clear descriptions about not only the vertical networks, but the horizontal networks. And I think all of that is really compelling. Like, and think in the United States, we talk about, well, the United States is a federal system and it does all of this. But how do you test it? Like, and I don't think you can test it, but I think obviously what you've done is like a wonderful description. So I think, you know, you don't need the econometrics, but it's just really interesting to see how that all aligns.
And it's a really important theoretical frame as well. I think that's a huge contribution here. It's theoretical.
I mean, I would love if somebody could like put this in numbers and run a few models with it, right?
I mean, I think this is, there are models that are consistent with the results that you're getting. Especially in like property rights and decision making. So there is, I mean, I'm not really surprised by the result. I think like it's consistent with what I would have thought, you know, people in a situation where they have a joint interest in protecting themselves, have incentives to self-organize in different kinds of ways, either through amalgamation or you know, other kinds of arms lengths and informal kind of relationships. And I think we observe both here. Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah.
What I think is amazing in case of Ukraine is that, of course, a lot of this organization happens, at least in the municipal level. You would expect a post-Soviet state to organize bypassing the state, because at least that's how we are used to think that the post-Soviet state is very detached from its society. But what we observe here is that the state, so as a self-government body, it's not detached from the society. There is overlaps and communication, and that's why we make a point about like social contract change, because we think, you know, long term, no country in this world can survive with, or no society in this world can survive without a state, and especially if we are now threatened for being Ukrainians, you know, like Russia wants to erase this country and this nation, then we really need a strong state. And that's why, and this increasing attachment is to that we have a communication with it. It's already a big move forward. And I think it differentiates Ukraine from other post-Soviet states, except maybe Baltic states.
It's just, I think it's so significant in so many ways, because even the political science literature on decentralization is not, decentralization and development is not very like optimistic,
No.
right? There almost feels like decentralization is really bad for so many outcomes.
Decentralization of corruption.
Right, yeah, decentralized corruption. And I think what you're showing here is not just like the theoretical and the empirical, but I really like the theoretical framing. Like the anticipatory, the collective action, all of these different elements that have to go into this. And then that Ukraine, but it predated the war, right? These reforms predated the war that ruptured that post-Soviet break, where the state is so detached from society. You see in so many of these countries, right? But yet somehow this decentralization reform actually made the center stronger. And that is a real paradox, I think, for a lot of their church.
It's true. There is a good research by Valentina Romanova, who looks at elections, like multi-level elections, and looks what's going on. And she really found that somehow the local strengthening actually made the center also strengthened. That was like really her argument. And I think what works in Ukraine is this decentralization, which put more emphasis on gromada, so the municipalities. It can help avoid regionalization, which can have any, like regionalization is a problem for secessionist moves. You know, we are region so and so, we want to be separate republic. But then there's no single municipality of which we have has such a, you know, it doesn't even come as an idea. It makes no sense. And they become more attached to the unitary Ukraine too, because this is where they profit. As easy as that.
Do you have a question?
I think there was a question.
Recently, we were offered with one global warming this year, and was even I think there is, and she talked about how transdisciplinary frameworks and intersectionality terms like what political science and like major topics on their head, global studies like that thing. And before, usually the state is seen as the most important like thing in political science and international relations, whereas global studies focuses on the individual and then goes to the local. So would you say then that this research and the evidence that you found actually supports the ideas of challenging past political science frameworks and how we think about war and how we win a war? And or would you say that it's more of an add-on? I would say a challenge, but what?
I mean, I think you still need to win the war, you need weapons, right? And this all is not possible if we get bombed more and there is no infrastructure, nothing, and no place to stay and live and so on. And in current situation, we have states that decide whether they give weapons or not. So for the empirical, and we still, in a way, we think in a world which is post-realism, but the whole politics is done still in the realist framework, with which my question is, my answer is, I think in general, this challenges this whole focus on the state, because also cities become now very active in climate change, for example. Especially, I learned recently that when in the United States, when Trump said, okay, we don't do any Paris Agreement and so on, the city stepped in and they said, we will keep working on it. But after all, we live in this whole still with post-Cold War world where there are states who decide. Even the whole European Union may be the one that is the most advanced super state project, still doesn't release foreign policy and security to a supranational structure, right? They still do it at the governmental level. So I think empirically, we are not there yet where we could say we challenge now the focus on the state. But I think we should think about it. And at the same time, we still need states for protection and for security at the world we live in.
And then these states get stronger by like decentralizing, which is like so paradoxical, right? It's just not the way that people normally. At least the political science and economists have models for this, but political science is so. Do you have questions online?
Well, then, I mean, this kind of broader question, like the United States is a polycentric system, much like how I think how you're describing Ukraine. And the United States has a very strong state and can provide military defense. And I think going back to like you know, Ali and I, we spend a lot of time talking about polycentricity as a model, like how to test it. What do you mean by polycentricity? But I mean, I think the idea here, like you started off kind of framing it like there's an idea that like a monocentric system is almost necessary to provide for security, can coordinate people through from a top-down perspective. And I think the theory here is why would polycentricity work in Ukraine? And then you provided a lot of evidence that polycentricity does work. And then I think this follow-up research will test that further because you have enough data to actually at a more fine-grained level test it. So I think the test of the theory is Ukraine is providing the public good of defense through a decentralized system, and you described all of that. You know, I mean, there's, you know, some work that looks at, you know, in the United States, the Articles of the Confederation was very decentralized, and then you had a more centralized system with the Constitution. What was the Article of Confederation able to do as a very decentralized system? Well, provide the public good, getting rid of the British, right? And so I think there is a test. You're providing a lot of evidence consistent with the theory of polycentric defense and polycentric security. And I think that there'll be follow-up papers to test it more with quantitative evidence. But I think in thinking about this, I mean, I think the idea that I don't necessarily think it's that paradoxical to think about polycentricity as providing for a strong state, because I think the United States is polycentric, maybe the strongest state that's ever existed.
But I want to say the comparative politics literature disagrees. I mean, I know we probably in the United States, obviously, but the comparative politics literature, that the empirical research done in comparative politics shows something very different. And I don't think that they're thinking, but I think that there's things that are missing from that, like legitimacy issues. Often people just think that they measure this in terms of service delivery and corruption, and but the service delivery part, right? Like they look at public goods from one context to the next, and okay, decentralization may be harming public goods, but what they often miss is that the decentralization component actually strengthens legitimacy. And there's can be a trade-off there between legitimacy and efficiency. And sometimes like a decentralized system may not, I'm not saying the case with Ukraine, but there could be trade-offs. It may not be as efficient. It may introduce, new layers, but on the other hand, in the long term, it's more effective because it's seen as more legitimate by citizens.
It's a very important point, and I saw it made by two authors who were arguing why democracies are better at war. And I can't remember the authors, unfortunately, but their point was that because democracy is so much built on self-organization and initiative and like responsibility even for your where you are and what you do, that the military personnel in the democratic state is much more also innovative, takes initiative and creative, and that's one of the arguments how democracies can win war. I mean, the other one was that democracies really don't go to war that often, but if they do, then they win. That was the point. But actually, polycentric governance. So we came to this from disaster research, right? And ecology and preparation and resilience. Even the term we borrowed, at least our thinking is very shaped by this literature, not really polycentric security. And plus, what where I started with this puzzle of the military spending is because it was very common, especially in the first couple of weeks, to say, "Oh, look, Ukraine has so many tanks, Russia has so many tanks. There's no way Ukraine can stand against Russia." So it was made more like a lay argument, but it was very popular. So we tried to go against it. And we are both scholars of anti-corruption, corruption, citizen participation. Suddenly we found ourselves talking about security. Thanks a lot.
Any other questions for Oleksandra? Well, thank you so much for coming here all the way to Pittsburgh.
It was really, really my pleasure. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this with your questions. Let me know if you, I'm here, so.
Yes, and we're going to follow up quite a lot because
Kyiv School of Economics is very strong partners with us. This Institute for Decentralization and Local Governance was set up by our colleague Timothy Petrach, who is a very important partner to us at Center for Governance and Markets.
He's the rector of our Kyiv School of Economics of the university.
Yes, and the youngest rector in the history of Ukraine.
Yes.
Poor guy.
I don't want to be him.
But thank you so much. Thank you for coming. And we put this together very quickly because Oleksandra is going back to Europe. She's just a visiting fellow for a few more work weeks here in Washington. Brian, thanks to you. Thanks to Luna for putting this together so quickly. Very, very grateful for your support. And thanks to all of you for coming, and tune in for more of our Center for Governance and Markets events. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.